Well, good afternoon. Thank you to the faithful and to the few that are here. We love the fact that we can have a very intimate conversation. It will allow us to dig deep and allow us to get to the heart of what this is all about. My name is Matthew Ball, and I'm the Director of International and Public Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is a responsibility that works directly with diplomats throughout all of California that are responsible for the Western United States, anywhere from 8 to 13 states. We are very fortunate because of our panel today, a very distinguished panel, and I'd like to introduce them briefly to you. Our Professor Carmen Dominguez. She is the president of the Latin American Consortium for Religious Freedom. Dr. Dominguez, very wonderful to have you here. Thank you. Professor Juan Navarro Floria, the president of the Argentine Council for Religious Freedom. Thank you very much for being here, Professor. And Professor Rodrigo Sousa Alves. Muito obrigado por estar aqui conosco, então, eh? And Edgardo Muguereza. Thank you very much, our Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department, North Peru. Also, Professor Alves, I did not say that you are the General Coordinator of the Brazilian Center of Studies in Law and Religion, so thank you very much for being here. It's a privilege to have you here. This is one of those moments and those times when we get to reflect on the religious freedom and those challenges of the freedom of conscience and of our religiosity, no matter where we live and whatever region we are in. Just let me know if I'm speaking too fast. I will slow down. I apologize. I do this without realizing I speak fast. But the thought that comes to my mind is, in the Old Testament, when the prophet Samuel was just a young man, and he was in bed, and Eli the prophet was asleep, and the young boy came to Eli and heard the prophet Eli say, "Samuel." And he went to Eli, and he did this, and Eli says, No, I didn't say anything, go back to bed. He heard the voice and said, "Samuel." The young boy got up again, went into Eli, and Eli said, "I didn't say anything, go back to bed." And the third time when this finally happened, and the young Samuel went into Eli, and Eli said, now I see what's happening. Go back to bed, and when you hear this voice again, say, "Yea, Lord, it's me. I'm here, your servant. I'll do whatever you're bidding." I'm paraphrasing, of course, but as I reflect upon that, I reflect upon each one of us in our own space, in our own area, as we hear the voice of God, and we reflect upon how we hear that, and that impression and that voice that comes to us, it causes each of us to say, all right, how is it that we will take that voice and it impels us to express ourselves publicly and privately in our own faith beliefs and in our own religions, and how we can openly avoid or deal with the restrictions that may come with the limits of presenting our own conscience and worshiping according to the dictates of our own conscience. These are challenges for all of us. I think of Daniel the prophet as a young man when King Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem and then asked for those 4 young men that were the pride of Israel to come and live with him, and then wanted him to eat of their wine and of their meat. And when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego then refused to do that, everyone was very concerned for their safety. And then, as we know, because of their conscience and their desire to live according to their laws and their personal beliefs in the midst of what could have been a death sentence for them, they turned around and proved that their physical ability and their agility and their stamina would be stronger in the long run. I know we know these stories, but they come back to worshiping as we know we should in our space, regardless of the externalities that might affect us. These are very affecting things that we all know and share in common. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that went on to worship and then be cast into the fire but were not killed. Even Daniel the prophet not being eaten by the lions because he refused to worship the God that was not his. And then, of course, surviving and realizing that Daniel's God is the true God and was declared as such. With that in mind, we stand in a place of religionists and people of faith where we have a chance to express ourselves in a way that other people might say their God is not just important to them, but it's important enough for us to respect and to allow them to worship as they please. So amidst all of this, we find that the freedom of conscience and religion and beliefs is one of the oldest and most fundamental of our human rights. We're anchored in the constitutional and regional human rights that are instruments of the Western Hemisphere. Yet every country faces challenges of varying types and degrees in this area. Religious diversity typically means that many smaller communities and believers suffer discrimination or even persecution. Tensions emerge between religious and secular outlooks, and religion can be instrumentalized or become a source of conflict. It can also be guilty of infractions of its own that earn bad press. So many times we are reflecting upon those terrible things that happen, those atrocities, those heinous things that get blamed on religionists because of what appears to be fanaticism or an overextension of our beliefs. We are guilty by association for being too fanatical, too much fervor in our own beliefs. So the questions that we have surround ourselves with: how do we do this? How do we survive within our areas, within our countries and our regions, worshiping as we please, and yet living within the boundaries that are restricted or held by our own governments? These are the questions that we hope to pose today, and I hope to turn some time over to each one of our panelists so that they can have a chance to express how they reflect and they see this in their own space, and then how we might interact and regard them as it relates to our own. So let's begin with Professor Carmen Dominguez. Would you like to begin with us? And we're going to turn about 10 minutes of time over to each one of you and let you express this about your own space and your reference, and then we'll just go right down the line. So please, Professor, why don't you begin and explain your position? Thank you.
Organizers, for all the people that are here represented, for this invitation, for this opportunity to exchange, to learn, to reflect, just as it has been so far. Of course, I would like to try to reply or answer the first question that has to do with what could be these situations that we can take into account when we see these challenges of freedom of belief. And it is very difficult to give an answer, because in the reality of these concepts, it is not the same even among the different countries of the West Hemisphere or in the continents. So that is why I could not really talk about what I don't know, but instead of that, I would just be talking about Chile and the reality that may be common to some of the American countries as these encounter require. So the first challenge that we can see comes from that increasing secularization of the privatization of what is religious in the private sector. And that has been happening as an erosion to the freedom of religion in some countries that historically used to be very believers. Especially, we can see this as one of the main cultural changes that countries such as Chile have had in the last 30 years. If we keep in mind, with the exception of Mexico, Cuba, and probably Uruguay, in all of the others, those conflicts between state and religion didn't really happen. And actually, there was a natural supposition or presupposition of its existence in the public sphere. So because of this secularization, we experimented a diminution, a decrease of those that identify as believers, and very specifically for young people. And this is not just a number that is reducing, that of course would be important already, but on top of that reduction, numeric reduction, it is also in many cases, something that is translated into a total lack of understanding, or even more, a questioning to those that believe and have their personal beliefs. So this is translated as well into a difficulty or an aggression that receive those that identify as believers, so that they can freely practice in the public space of their faith. And I work in the university, I work forming young people. And so that is what young people tell us sometimes, that they want to be practicing a certain faith, but they have that issue to be understood and respected. And also, very evidently, this can be translated into the questioning of the participation of these religious conventions in the public spaces whenever they intervene in different type of debates, usually that are vital for the entire country. And so, of course, those would be victories for all the citizens. And so this is how, little by little, we have had some conflict between state and religion that before we would never think of. First, those that have came from the legal reforms for the right to life, specifically about the right to the person who's about to be born, or abortion, which traditionally was forbidden or prohibited in Latin American law, and also not practicing abortions for healthcare professionals. That has, of course, turned into a very strong debate for conscious objection. And afterwards, with all of the reforms that we have seen in terms of family law that also have put at stake that part of the marriage between a man and a woman through recognizing same-sex marriages, among others. And to these, some other public policies have also been added, those that have fostered the relevance of sexual preference in the education, for example. And many parents have been focusing on the type of education that they want to give their children. In some other countries, they have forbidden to have religion as part of the public education, and also they will sometimes have sex education that would question the anthropology of many beliefs. So as never before, now we have the need to at least have that recognition of the freedom of conscience, to at least keep the beliefs in such essential matters for those that are believers, and that also mark that there is a comprehension of the person and their dignity. And so with this, what I mean is that respect to life from the conception until the natural death, the family that is built between a man or a woman, and the preferences for education in a family and how they would be educating their children are part of their identity. We're not talking about traditions as it was mentioned before, but instead they are part of their identity. We are what we are according to what we believe and according to how we want to live our lives. So the denial from the state affects their beliefs and their conscience. And so these illustrates that topics that used to be shared socially, now it has been eroded, or these have been substituted. And at the end, I don't want to say with that religious freedom only has to do with these topics that I mentioned, but it also allows us to show how the collective dimension of religious freedom has to do with the beliefs or the doctrines of some religious organizations that could even be illegal to the state. So these debates challenge the life of many believers that are starting to live as minority, even if by numbers they are not necessarily such, because they feel excluded from the public policies. And so, of course, this represents a huge challenge to the strength of their beliefs and also how they live their lives and how they transmit or communicate their ideas. Now, what type of answer could we give to this if the response, and I am a lawyer, only was focused on acknowledging these freedom of conscience and religion, and that they are just part of the international legal framework? We would actually have to say that in very isolated exceptions in our region, there is no persecution in terms that many believers suffer in other parts of the world, where their lives really is at stake day by day. I was reading that in Nigeria just last Sunday, people died just because they wanted to go to a mass. Obviously, we are not suffering that life of persecution, right? But instead, what we are facing and what we are seeing is this sort of harassment in terms of the freedom of expression from religious leaders or the media, like, for example, as it happens in Mexico or Venezuela.
Centering in Latin America, it's very difficult to think about lines of work to overcome discrimination of the principles that I just mentioned. In many countries, legislation has been passed that do not allow to express in the public sphere ideas different from for abortion or couples that are not heterosexual. In those countries, legislation has been approved that bans discrimination, and that when they conflict with that suspect category called religion, with other categories such as sexual orientation or gender identity, the courts give prevalence to the second one. And this is, for example, the case with the Inter-American Court. Some countries have passed legislation that um, ban hate based on religion, but in practice, some principles are defended um, that are considered incorrect, and the political questioning by the press does does not take into account the attacks from social media. So some decide to uh, remain silent and leaving those in public who defend opposing ideas. This is an error because the silence is not possible. As St. Matthew's Gospel says, we don't light a lamp to keep it hidden, but to give light in the house. And second, because in the respect of beliefs, the dignity of the person is at stake, and that's why they were recognized as fundamental rights in most international treaties and Western constitution. Third, because the culture and development of countries is enriched by the plurality of ideas. That's why religious beliefs should continue being expressed in the public sphere, preserving their autonomy and the right to educate people in their own beliefs. So what are the tools, or what is the way that we should adopt? I think it's difficult to provide an original answer in the framework of this forum, because the first answer one can think of is that religions should be united, because many religions, or most religions, are not understood in many countries. So, and they are even under suspicion regarding certain issues. Some don't understand how they can keep some beliefs, and some are considered to be fanatics. And some behaviors have caused scandal or behaviors, and some people that are intolerant have caused some weakening of religious beliefs that prevail in the media, instead of showing or highlighting the good, or the good works that are carried out to help the most vulnerable in society. So one important step is to become united as religious organizations and make contributions to social life, contribute to the development of our countries. And sometimes this goes unnoticed, because sometimes they are not worried about, or they don't care about spreading the good that is done. In particular, they are present in the most important moments in life, in education of children, in the hardest moments in life, such as disease and death. It is evidence that states cannot get to all of them, and the action of the church and of the faithful it, cover or make up for the deficiencies of the state to satisfy the needs of the people, and that this unit should be reflected in public life, in public debates regarding the life of the people. We, however, not doing this is renouncing the contributions that should be made to build a better society, and to give better, and to better meet the needs of the people. And in the search for these answers is compatible with democracy, with respect for human life, and with respect for freedom of conscience and religion. If those who profess these freedoms do not intervene in the public space, what they are doing is obviously impoverishing the development of nations. So what we have to do is actively participate and express our beliefs that go unnoticed and are not noticed by the faithful. And many positions sometimes seem that cannot be understood because they are not known, and sometimes they are featured in a very simplistic way, or they are mocked by the media. And I think this shows the complexity of the joint work in the positions regarding the protection of life or abortion, or such as wearing a veil in public, because many do not know these facts, and that's why they don't agree with those. And in order to work jointly, we need to at least respect the beliefs of others and contribute to recognizing the institutional autonomy of these issues in the public field, respect for religions and pluralism. And to finish, because I know that I went over time, I would like to mention that we should work jointly to at least have or achieve freedom of conscience when people's beliefs are threatened, to allow people that need to live with this conflict on a daily basis so that they can live according to their own freedoms and beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dominguez. We appreciate that. Professor Florio, would you like to address us, please?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As Professor Dominguez has taken part of my time, I should say that I agree and give the floor to the next speaker. But I would like to say make a few comments. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation to participate in this important forum. It is my pleasure to be here. We've been asked 3 questions, and I would like to briefly answer some of them with very precise comments. The first one is, what key issues of freedom of conscience and religion we face in our region, in our hemisphere? When we think about the restrictions to religious freedom, we can think of 2 places. They come from the state or from societies. There are states that persecute religions, and there are societies that are intolerant with religion. In our region in general, our states do not persecute based on religious reasons. We have the case of Cuba, that unfortunately and painfully Venezuela and Nicaragua over the past few years, among other restrictions to human rights, there is the restriction to of religious freedoms. If we think about the restrictions of freedom of religion in general, we don't find big conflicts, because if something characterizes our region, as Mr. Durham was saying this morning, is that there is quite a broad freedom of religion, and there are no conflicts among religions. There are no wars or religious wars as it happens in other places. But what does happen, and Carmen explained it very clearly, is that this phenomenon of increasing secularization, where on the one hand religions are cornered, and or the majority religions, or some religions that have grown in Latin America, such as the evangelical, and that have become the preferred enemy for these groups involved in secularization. but they look for extreme secularization where an important actor is the radical feminism or the LGBTQ groups that have an agenda targeted to women, where they want to make women invisible, and everything is about empowering these types of groups. This situation, I believe, creates a crisis for one of the main principles of human rights, which is in the interdependence of human rights. And why do I say this? Because when we see that new human rights, quote unquote, emerge, for example, when a right to abortion is proclaimed, this is in conflict with freedom of religion, both in the collective sphere when we talk about promoting a certain doctrine, and also in the individual field, the issue of freedom of conscience that is restricted because we face the absolute truth of these so-called new human rights groups. And we see opposition, for example, freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And this conflict between freedom of religion and speech, we see in different ways. The restrictions imposed on free expression of religious doctrine, where they want to exclude it from the political or the public debate. That shouldn't happen. And on the other hand, there is an absolute freedom, so to speak, of those who express their views against of religion, and it seems that they can say anything without any limitation. These days, today or yesterday, we've seen the important contribution of religions to the fight or the work to support the marginalized, social work, work with migrants, and that is very valuable. But I think it is very important to recognize that religion in itself has value. And it's important that states and societies recognize this. We shouldn't forget that religion in itself has values for people, for families, and for society as a whole. The second question we were asked is, what steps can we take or should be taken to solve the most severe ways of persecution? And I would like to say a few things. First, the existence of freedom of religion, of conscience, should happen in democratic societies. This should be protected. And I remember the work of Brian Greene on this topic, that this freedom contributes to economic growth, to a better development of societies. But this doesn't contradict what I just said, that religion has value in itself. I preside an organization that's Al-Khalil, that many times has proposed something that could be a very useful tool, that is the Inter-American Convention of Freedom of Religion, that the states should formally do through the OAS mechanisms, to have an instrument that could be very important to define the scope and requirements of freedom of speech, both in its individual phase, for example, freedom of consciousness, and in its collective phase. In the Pavés case, the Inter-American Court which for the first time has begun to study freedom of religion, has made a very important recognition. And this requires development and specific tools to guarantee its existence. Legal norms in themselves do not solve the problems, but they help. They are a tool for governments and societies. The principles, the general norms that we have in Article 12 of in the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights should be explored, and the consequences should be taken into account.
And also related to this, let's remember that we have a real issue in America, and that is a convention that has already been approved by the Organization of American States, which is against any type of discrimination and lack of tolerance, which doesn't help because even if, yes, it has very positive and valuable aspects, at the same time, let's say that according to the interpretation that can be done, it can cause an increase of these conflict between the freedom of religion or, for example, a direct threat to the freedom of expression, the freedom of religion. So this convention is an example of something that is not well done. And it is because of that reason that it has been ratified in very few countries, and it has been a cause of concern in some other countries. So this is exactly why a convention about freedom of religion probably would help to balance things and maybe provide tools that would be from a different nature, but that could have or give a bigger picture about this matter. And the third question that we were asked is if there are some steps that religious institutions or actors could probably take, some activities that they can have, they can carry out along with the freedom of beliefs. I believe that today a lot of things have been said already, but I would like to just give a proposal, and this is a proposal that I would allow myself to bring, and maybe that could be escalated. Apart from everything that we have mentioned in terms of the possible convention and the before the declaration of religion, of the freedom of religion, and it has to do something that is key, which is education. And in the Pavés case, the Inter-American Court has highlighted so clearly one of the very important things of that ruling is recognizing the right for to have education in religious education in public schools. And everything else would be, of course, depending on the country. But I think it would be great if in all the countries we can achieve, maybe some would have some other modalities to be exercising this right, which is recognized by the American Convention and that the court has ratified. It would be good to achieve that maybe we could have some way to teach religion at schools. And so for that, it would be really great, I believe, that these organizations, religious organizations, probably could have some guidelines and maybe make some proposals or give some sort of guide so that we can take it as an example of religious teachings that is not just going to allow to have an intellectual knowledge of what religions are and what they represent for students and people, that of course is crucial. But on top of that, it is also something necessary so that we can go deeper in the ethics and the ethical basis of everything that we see daily living with each other. And this is not something that is coming from nowhere. There was a Costa Rica Pact, and it says, and I would like to quote Article 13.2, that the member states in this protocol agree that this should be included in the development of the human development and growth and their dignity. And then it would also have to go hand in hand with the ideologic pluralism, the freedom of religion, justice, and peace. It is also agreed that education should train all people so that they can effectively participate in a pluralist society to have a dignified living to foster friendship among all nations and all racial or religious groups and promote peace, etc., etc. So what this means is we're talking about the friendship among the different religious groups and respect, and it is only possible through knowledge. I cannot love somebody that I don't know. And for me to be able to know these religious dimension of the person without education, that is incomplete. So we need to have specific programs, and with those, we can have access to that knowledge. The Inter-American Court, again, in this Pavés case, has already mentioned and highlighted these specific aspect. That is why going beyond the legal norms or standards that I was referring to before, I think it would be important, and maybe the OAS would be a good platform to do it. Maybe we could achieve something similar to what the OECD managed to do in Europe when, after a lot of work, they managed to publish the principles of Toledo about teachings of religions and beliefs in public schools. This is a work that allowed for everybody to agree on these type of guidelines and how teachings about religion should be taken to schools. And this should also be agreed among the religious institutions. This should not be a task for the states, or not mainly for the states, but this is a challenge so that the conventions can sit down together so that we can work on these guidelines, on these guides, that afterwards they could be taken to the states so that we can promote the teaching of religions. And we're not talking about each one of the teachings that we are seeing in each one of our churches, but instead we're talking about all of the schools so that then we can overcome this issue, which is religious ignorance, the lack of knowledge of religion and religions. And as I was mentioning, also the lack of knowledge about the ethical basis in society. So I believe that this is a very interesting challenge. And it really should be appealing. Of course, it is a lot of work to achieve it, but I think this would allow for us to have an advancement and to break these obstacles that we find many times, to ask the OAS to call the religious conventions so that they can work together for this. So that would be the proposal that I would like to communicate this afternoon. And with this, I'm done with my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Flotti. I appreciate that very much. We'd like to go to Professor Alves. Please, just be mindful, we want to be able to make sure we've got time for everyone, so please.
All right, thank
please,
you.
Take the podium here.
Yep, thank you, Matthew. And I would like also to thank Cole and all the organizers of this forum. It has been an amazing opportunity for us to discuss very important issues to the region, and I'm very glad and honored to be here. So our panel aims to discuss responding the challenges of freedom of conscience and religion, and it seems to me that most of the issues that I was going to discuss were mentioned by Carmen and by Juan. But I would like to bring light to these issues from some other perspectives as well. So the first one, and I think that's a very important issue, is what is the place of religion in modern societies or in modernity? The secularization thesis was a central debate in sociology of religion in the second half of the 20th century. And basically, it was the idea that modern societies would face a decline in spirituality and religiosity of people and of societies in general. But what we saw was something different. Sociologists more recently have been defending different types of secularization, such as what Peter Berger called the multiple altars of modernity, for example. The secularization didn't lead to the decline of religion, but to a different phenomenon, which is pluralism or religious pluralism. So when we think about the place of religion in public life, we should take into account that this idea of pluralism in terms of religion also leads to different perspectives on the relationship between state and religions. The idea of differentiation and separation between state and religion is the result of overlapping perspectives about the secular state, which comprise a large number of secularism theories, ranging from secular and humanist sources to theological and religious doctrines about state and politics. The process of secularization and the concept of religious state, of secular state, therefore do not necessarily lead to the exclusion of religion from the public life and from the public space. Religion is one of the drivers of secularization, especially the role played by the Protestant Reformation in the Western world. And also to pluralization of religious identities is one of the results of the modernization of societies. Additionally, secularization of states and governments do not require from states to avoid interactions with religious communities. On the contrary, it allows to collaboration and cooperation between both separate spheres and refrains the state from imposing a neutral or secular worldview on citizens. So what is the role played by freedom of religion and conscience and the relationship between freedom of religion and conscience and other human rights? The protection of religious freedom as a human right demands that one's freedom to believe and not to believe, to practice and not to practice any religion should be taken into account seriously in decision-making processes that might affect religious life. While human rights are interdependent and interconnected, as my colleagues mentioned, there are many situations in which they might be perceived as in conflict or opposition, or mutually exclusive or incompatible. Although there are tensions that naturally come from the complexities of the normative systems, the solution to challenging situations related to the implementation of human rights is not denying the importance of the religious factor. Individual and collective dimensions of freedom of religion, as Carmen Dominguez mentioned, are requirements of the protection of human dignity. While religious freedom is not an absolute right, it is certainly an important human right which historically created the conditions for diversity of worldviews. States have a duty to reconcile and to harmonize human rights in tension. And in this process, freedom of religion or belief, as well as the religious needs and requirements, should play a significant role. The secularity of the state must not be a reason or a ground for placing religious perspectives and worldviews under non-religious discourses, which may be as comprehensive as religious perspectives usually are. It is easier to block religious discourses due to the secular nature of states, and at the same time favor non-religious perspectives that may offer alternative interpretations of reality, of social life. So, what is the importance of freedom of religion or belief in contemporary societies? Freedom of religion or belief has been recognized as one of the core values of democratic societies and rule of law. Democracy and religious freedom are mutually reinforcing. It is a human right affirmed by all human rights systems, as Carmen mentioned, and is a fundamental right in most of the world's constitutions. Religious freedom for all means that everyone has the right to believe, not to believe, to change, and to practice one's religion or belief alone or in community with others. Religious freedom is the foundation for mutual respect, for peaceful coexistence, and for dialogue. such as the Inter-American Dialogue that was envisaged by the OAS, the Organization of American States, in its previous, and it's in the three previous omnibus resolutions. And as mentioned before, freedom of religion or belief contributes for economic, human, and sustainable development, increasing human capabilities and autonomy. It is a right for majorities and a right for minorities, as well as a right for traditional religions and for new religious movements. Religious freedom is, some authors would say that it is a first fundamental right or human right as we see these kind of rights nowadays. So it has an historical importance. It has an importance for democracies, for rule of law, since it allows people to live in accordance to what they believe. Of course, it's not an absolute right, but it's not a right that is less important than the new human rights. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face today when we think about the big picture. So what is the place of religion in public life? But more than that, what is the place of freedom of religion or belief in the human rights system? Sometimes it is an object of criticism and placed under other human rights, or it's interesting that it is not difficult to find expressions like religious freedom and human rights, and sometimes referring to religious freedom not as a human right, but something else. So I think that the secularization process led to a plural society, and religious freedom is one of the core values and elements that allow for a peaceful coexistence. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alves. Edgardo, we look to you to help us now.
Afternoon, everyone. After listening to Carmen, Juan, Rodrigo, definitely we feel that there are many proposals to work on them today more than ever. I was listening to Juan and the Convention of Freedom of Religion, and I believe this is something, a point that the Forum of the Americas should consider. The other point that Rodrigo was reminding us was a parliamentary table of freedom of religion that led by Dr. Damaris Moura in Brazil. It would be very important to work on that project of parliamentary tables, congressmen, lawmakers, legislators that can carry the banner of freedom of religion. From our perspective, I would like to reflect this afternoon here. First, we believe that freedom is considered the most complex idea in the history of philosophy and ideas. Freedom is very difficult to be fully embraced due to its implications. In practical terms, freedom is even difficult to accept because it means loss of power over people. Most of the tragedies in human experience are related to the desire to dominate, to submit, to make another an instrument taking their freedom. Embracing freedom, my dear friends, means the end of manipulation of others or respect of their conscience. It means showing solidarity for humankind and its dignity and the rights of every human being and of every group of people. It means the end of discrimination. it means the end of criminality towards other people because they are different. The use of force and coercion are enemies of the authentic religion. God himself worships when this happens freely, even if all rights are of utmost importance. We believe that freedom of religion is specifically important, and it has to do not only with the human dimension, but with the relationship of the person with God, the Creator. Therefore, we see freedom of religion as the main human right from which all the human rights are derived. And here I would like to touch upon a topic that may be difficult, and I would still like to talk about it, the separation of church and state. And this is in harmony with the declaration of Jesus of give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. So the Adventists believe that the union of church and state is a safe formula for discrimination and intolerance. And it offers fertile ground for persecution against those who feel, believe, or have a different view. The civil government has the right to demand respect and obedience to the point that the civil laws are not in conflict with God's requirements, because it is necessary to obey God before we obey men. And this is his word in the peaceful coexistence between state and church is one of the big challenges of today. Discussing options for respect for differences. We strongly believe in freedom of religion for every person. So this is the conscience of each individual, not of a government, that should determine its choices for worship or the lack of them. That's why we believe that fighting against religious oppression and defending the right of an individual to worship according to his or her conscience without respect to the religious affiliation of that person favors everyone without distinction. Normally, friends, the people belonging to religious groups that are a minority and that are not very structured, such as the African and Ubanda religions, are a target for discrimination. But there are also incidents among more traditional religions that are better established. We believe that freedom of religion is a right given by God, that legislation and other government acts that bring together church and state are contrary to the best interests of both institutions, and they are potentially harmful for human rights. That's why we defend that freedom of religion is better exercised where separation of church and state is maintained. That government was divinely ordered to support and protect the citizens in the use of the natural rights and to govern in civil issues. And in doing so, the government guarantees obedience, respectful obedience, and willful support. The undeniable right to freedom of conscience, to have a religion of their choice, to change the religious belief according to their conscience, expressing their religion individually or or in communion with others, in the worship practices and teachings subject to respect for equivalent rights of others. I would like to finish by saying the following, that freedom of religion also includes the freedom to establish and operate appropriately charitable institutions, to solicit and receive voluntary financial contributions, to observe days of rest, and celebrate holidays according to the rules of their religions, and to maintain communication with other um, faithful at the national and international level. Freedom of religion and the elimination of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or beliefs are essential to promote understanding, peace, and friendship between people. That the citizens must use legitimate means to avoid the decline of freedom of religion so that everyone can enjoy its worthy blessings. I would like to finish by saying that the spirit of true freedom of religion is summarized in the golden rule, golden standard: do to others as you would like to be done unto you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that, Edgardo. Appreciate everyone's comments. It raises a couple of immediate questions for me, and hopefully we can have this discussion and everyone gets to listen in on our questions here. But the thought is, how is it that we reconcile living within the law of the land when it may be in conflict with our own religious conscience? Would you like to address that, Carmen? How is it that we reconcile our own religious beliefs when the law of the land may be in conflict with that?
Yes, I think that that is exactly by recognizing the freedom of conscience, because it's not just a matter of having this freedom of religion, but also that freedom of conscience, which is also recognized as a fundamental right. And so this implies that we can then use that value of conscience and we can defend it in the face of those standards, those laws that probably would affect it. Of course, that is not any law or any standard, because then that means that probably the believer would be exempt from complying with the law, but instead those specifics that probably would be in conflict with essential or core beliefs. And so that takes us to that topic. So whenever we are, I mean, of course, yes, we are trying to have objection of conscience, and so it is necessary to have a law to recognize it, and then it has to really be acknowledged as soon as the freedom of conscience is recognized as well. So that is the first thing to take into account. Now, of course, this conscientious objection is part of it. So when there is an issue or whenever there is a situation, then that is when it can actually be exercised, because otherwise we really wouldn't have the need to have it, or we would be forbidding it from being exercised. So I think that is the response. And I hope that the state would not force everybody to be so rigid. I think that conscientious objection would be a different matter, but starting with the thought that maybe it has had an evolution. Of course, by imposing, for example, the military service, and then it started to be also acknowledged in some other areas that probably before there was really never a conflict or a need to recognize it, as maybe now it could be from the healthcare professionals when we talk about abortion. And we have seen that there are some legislations that are not even willing to respect the fact that somebody would not like to do something that goes according to not just their conscience, but also their profession. And so they would happily deny doing it. I share what Carmen is mentioning. Probably I would say the same thing, but backwards. That is, the first thing that probably we would need to desire is not to have that conflict. That is, that laws are fair laws and laws that are not putting anybody in that situation where they would have to object or oppose to them. And so for that, it is necessary for the religious conventions and believers, and not just institutionally, but people can actually have that freedom of expression that is important, that is guaranteed, so that they can participate in the public debate, so that they can give their points of view, and they can show whatever they think that is fair, that is good, and so the law should be a reflection of it. Now, if after that debate that debate, the law says something that is unacceptable for the believer, then, well, that is where the conscientious objection would come, as it was mentioned, in those matters that are really no negotiables. But at the same time, it is true that there are a lot of things or situations where you can be more or less happy with the solution that the law could offer, but definitely these would have to be reasonably challenged. So some citizens have to comply with the law. I mean, maybe some laws we don't like and we like some other better, but if at first they are not putting us in that core conflict, well, you can go ahead and comply with it. Now, if there is a conflict that is a no-negotiable because what the law is forcing us to do or forbidding us from doing is something that goes directly against a main value or a main principle, then we would really need to recognize a conscientious objection. And I would say that it is not necessary for the law to give it, because it is a consequence of the freedom of conscience and of religion that is already included in international agreements. So we have to defend that. We have that right even when the law is not giving it. But sometimes it happens, and yes, there is some controversy around it, because if we are going to be legislating about a controversial topic, then it would be better for the law to provide it. So I don't know, maybe it would be good to have a law maybe that is legitimating abortion without any issue, or assisted suicide, or many other situations. Well, it should really be recognized and say, hey, for whoever that has a religious objection or ethical objection, then you can use these tools.
Professor Alvarez, you've got some burning thoughts on this, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'd like just to take one step back, because sometimes we think about the problems that we face due to the current legislation and the need for conscientious objection. But I think maybe one of the possible solutions is to deal with those issues in the process of creating legislation, because law is a cultural, a social product, and usually they come from the majority culture, and sometimes from the secularization of the majority of institutions and structures of the majority religions. So let's take, for example, the day of rest, like Sunday, usually in Western societies is the day for, like, when people do not work. So it is basically the secularization of a Christian idea that Sunday is the day of the Lord, and we should rest in that day, or that's a sacred day. So, but that's not something that everyone believes. But of course, it's Sunday as a day of rest is not in the legislation, for example, as something religious. However, it has religious roots. So when we think about, we understand the reasons that are behind the laws that we create, and we allow the participation of different groups in the creation of legislation, maybe we can avoid some of these pitfalls and these issues that maybe the conscientious objection would be a way to solve that problem and to avoid a rupture in the democratic institutions and in the social order. However, maybe we should address those issues during the creation of legislation with an inclusive process for all groups.
Thank you very much. Edgardo, you've got a thought on this. I've got a question for you too.
Of faith should always be working with the legal area. In the group where we are working, we are the ones that are promoting the freedom of belief of religion. And so we have 2 or 3 lawyers, and inside our church, we believe that. So to avoid getting to that point, we need to participate at all the legislative discussion tables, because, for example, recently in Peru, we had a situation, and that is that the government called for a unique national test. And that was for a day that was not Saturday. And so over 1,000 teachers that usually rest during Saturdays, they went to that unique national test. And suddenly the government changed this for Saturday. And so I actually believe that Carmen mentioned something like this before. All beliefs should be working together. All religions should be working together, because today you're coming after me, but tomorrow maybe they will be coming after you. So this was a work that was not just done by activists, but also by the legal department, by the legal area. So we believe that as long as we have freedom, we really need to use all the tools that it allows and gives us.
So here's a difficult thought for you. And you mentioned this, Edgardo, and I love this thought when you said that the loss, a belief in religion and our adherence to our faith is actually a loss of power over people. In that comment, in that statement, it leads me to the dichotomy of our belief versus the fact that we are imperfect humans. And as a result, we're broken. We're always trying to repair ourselves. So it's incumbent upon us as a conglomerate or an amalgam of faiths to adhere to our religious doctrines, our religious creeds, our religious exercises and practices. And when we do not, then we are judged by others as, you see, you talk a good talk, but you're just not who you say you are. So it really puts a greater amount of pressure on those that proclaim religiosity and a desire to say, hey, you've got to allow us to live this way, but hey, look at us, we're broken. We keep making mistakes, and they point to what's broken more than they point to what we adhere to. And as a result, the brokenness is what shows up in the press. That's why they end up using the worst examples out there. They start to play the blame game of, it's a religionist. Again, it's another excuse for religion, which appears now to be fanaticism. And you see what religion does, this is how it goes. So the dichotomy for us is that we have this desire to express our beliefs just through living honestly and the best we can, always repenting, always trying to improve, always trying to get ourselves there. And so collectively, as you suggest, we have to support each other in this effort. And this forum and this opportunity here is a chance for us to build up and to enhance and to say we can do this and to really encourage one another to do this. So having your voices as a reminder of this is really critical, because now you're an example. If people expect a better behavior out of you, out of us, they expect it. And there's so much more of an expectation that when the mishap or the brokenness of our own humanity gets in the way, then it requires us to really measure ourselves, because we're being judged by so many others. So the question for us is, how do you reconcile this? How do you manage these two worlds where we're broken, but still we're asking everyone to accept our religiosity as a real effort to love one another and to be better than what's possible? You've got a thought. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You got a thought on this?
To preaching than a question, but I don't think that I could answer. I think that yes, from the religious world, and especially when we talk about leaders, we are expecting a certain type of example. Maybe that was the aim of the question. And evidently, you should not be demanding anything if you are not in conditions where you can show that you have a life that is coherent to what you are asking. But, you know, human nature is human nature. The issue or the mistake of one person should not be the motive to deny a right for everybody. So sometimes saying that, I mean, it's what happens now, right? We are going to be talking, for example, about assisted suicide, right? And then somebody says, well, you cannot really say anything because there are some priests that abuse children. Well, what does that even have to do? I mean, I condemn, I am so sorry that there are these situations for abuse of minors, but that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to say, well, it is not okay to kill somebody. So one thing is not accepting the other. I don't know if maybe that was a question.
No, that was very good. That's very good. Thank you for commenting on that. The idea is, oh, sorry? Oh, yes, you got a question, please. He's got one right behind you here.
Religion as a right to reestablish or to affirm some identity elements. And maybe I'm going back to the previous question. What happens in the interreligious sphere? Does that vary? For example, talking about abortion. In the interreligious dialogue, the abortion topic is not necessarily a topic that is going to reivindicate the freedom of religion. Because, for example, in the Muslim tradition and also in the Jewish tradition, up to the 14th week, it is possible to take abortion into account, right? And so in some other traditions, it happens as well. For example, Hinduism and some others. So what happens? How, from an interreligious platform, can we have these type of conversation with those characteristics that represent a position that could be within one or different Christian traditions? Because even within Christian traditions, when we talk about homosexuality, for example, there are some Christian churches that, yes, they open and they allow, and actually they are religious, they are leaders of their communities, but they are opening doors in that sense. So how can we make a declaration in terms of the religious declaration from a platform like this one in that sense?
Please, Professor Florio.
Well, I think that there are some topics that are not topics about religion. Abortion is not a topic about religion. Yes. Yes, yes. Yes, yes, of course, of course. Of course. Of course. What I mean, there are some discussions that probably should really be appropriately categorized. Now, beyond the fact that this is not religious, because we, in the last years in Argentina, we, at the end of the day, there is legislation about this matter. But there is a first matter that is the biological aspect of things. Now, talking in bona fide, it is undoubtedly that what we're doing is we are putting an end to the life of a human being. Just give me just 1 second.
Let me go to the point. Let me go to the point. From the legal standpoint, clearly we know that every human being is a person. So it is not legitimate to put an end to a person's life. So I admit that there may be religions that say in some cases it is legitimate to put an end to someone's life. So that decision to legitimate the end of a person's life, unless it is imposed on everyone, whether, allow me to finish, whether it is a religious idea or not. When abortion was discussed, and this, in Uruguay a few years ago, when President Tabaré Vázquez, who was an agnosticist and who is a physician, and had this very clear, he vetoed it, not because of a religious issue, but based on bioethics. So after saying this, it is true that some religions, some churches, some religious communities have a more strict belief or stronger belief as compared to others. Others are not so strict on this topic. So we are not going to have an agreement among all religions. The same can happen with the death penalty, drugs, and other issues. We cannot demand unanimous beliefs. What we can demand is that all beliefs are respected. So the law should try to be a common denominator that respects the majority beliefs, because that is democracy. But now, if there is a minority or part of the society that doesn't share, based on some strong convictions, the idea of the legislators, that when the idea of exception should be considered. So it is not necessary to be an unanimity among all religions, because, for example, the day of rest, as Rodrigo was mentioning, it is obvious that this is not a unanimous decision, because for some groups, the day of rest is Saturday, for others, it's Sunday. But no one should be forbidden from resting on the day that they believe in. So what should we say? That since there's not unanimity on a criteria for the day of rest, we cannot have a day of rest? No, we need to find a common ground and respect the right of those who don't agree with that majority decision. So moving away from this, the same is true in the abortion issue. So it is important to recognize and know, and I apologize for going back to my initial proposal, that we need to know what is the thought of religious communities, because sometimes out of ignorance, we do not respect some issues that are important for some. A few months ago, in the city of Buenos Aires, a law was passed that in order to take care of the babies born, it was established that any decision that affects the integrity of the baby is not approved. But okay, this is perfect, but what happens? The Jewish are in favor or practice circumcision, so that causes minimum harm to the integrity of the baby or of the person. So in that case, it is important for them to practice a surgical procedure that implies some, and we are talking about masculine circumcision, we are not talking about feminine circumcision. That's a different thing, that's a crime. So here we need knowledge, respect, and say, okay, the principle is correct, but we need an exception in this case, because it is fundamental for the Jewish religion to circumcise their male members. And this is a question of respect, and respect requires education. I would like to add that I agree with what Juan has said, but also there may be differences regarding some issues, but the religions should be in agreement, and this could happen in a forum like this, that religions have the right to participate in democratic debate and in the public debate, and they have the right to provide their own opinions. And it would seem that religions have less of a right to give their public opinions. So we have the right to provide our reasons, and reasons that are religious, because it happens today, at least in the Catholic world, that, okay, we can go to the public debate, but be careful, don't say a religious, don't give a religious reason. Well, if we are lawyers, we are going to give legal reasons. And if we are in religion, we are going to give a religious opinion. So sometimes it would seem that the religious opinion is not respected or has no value. So I think we all have to be in agreement on this.
Thank you very much. I know that we are out of time, but I wanted to just end with a singular thought, and it came up from all of your comments that brought me to this conclusion, and it's a personal study that I've been having lately, and it is regard to the word love. When you mentioned the two great commandments, to love our neighbor and to love our God, the thought came to me is that how you can sit in a room like this with people that we don't know and yet feel this immense connection of love without ever having any interaction with them before, and yet our commonality of religion or faith belief or religiosity allows us to know that we will serve anyone in this room with all of our hearts. We will serve them in any form and fashion that we can, and that we're able to do this. And that desire for service and that desire to do well amongst us is an immediate connection that we feel that makes us want to express ourselves through our physicality, through our service that says, I love you. And that love is something that can permeate and draw us together in such a unity that it will allow this unification of beliefs. Even though we're all of different faith origins and faith beliefs, it allows us to know that this love is something that can unite us through the hardest of times and through the fiercest of times. And so I would like to acknowledge and end on the note that it is easy to say thank you because we feel such love for you and us being here. It allows us to enhance that love and to feel even greater friendship towards people that we've just meeting for the first time or having met now. But it's such a gracious thing to be able to be here with you and to say, I love you, when in fact it is our commonality in this belief in our God and our desire to serve one another that allows us to be together here today. So thank you very much for all of your contributions, for your prepared comments, for your deep thinking on this. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here.